How's everyone doing this morning? So everyone enjoyed the Thanksgiving, and it is a blessing to in the camp meeting on Thursday and Thursday afternoon, and everyone had it all cleaned up by about 5 or 6 o'clock, except for the sheets and stuff, Miss Jimmy. But everything else, I mean, all the tables put up, chairs put up, decorations were down. And then we had to go a little bit extra because they're tearing the whole back of the tabernacle out. So we had to take out all the sound system that evening. But we were done by 7 on that right there. So that's all ready to come out. But it's a blessing to, have Friday, Saturday to recuperate. So anyway, but had a good camp meeting. Thank the Lord for that. And I hope everyone enjoyed their Thanksgiving. And so if you have your Bible, we're going to start in Ephesians chapter number 4. We're going to start in Ephesians. We're going to go back to 2 Samuel, But we're going to start in Ephesians chapter number 4. And I'm just going to read just a couple verses right here, starting in verse number 30. Because I was trying to come up with a thought right here, and so these verses do they say what I want to say. So it says, "And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby ye are sealed unto the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted." And this is the section I want to see. "Forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." So now turn back to 2 Samuel chapter number 11. 2 Samuel chapter number 11. And we'll read verse number 1 and 2 right here. It says, "And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon." I'm going to stop reading right there. We know the whole passage. We've went through it over and over and over again for the last, probably 6-7 weeks we've went through it. But anyway, so I told you originally whenever I got the thought about teaching on this, I wanted to teach on the beauty of Bathsheba. The beauty of Bathsheba. And Brother Parks, I think one of the things that I see when I read this, and I know that we don't read a lot about Bathsheba. We don't really see her words, but we see her actions. And so I'm going to base some of this. Some of this is going to be my assumptions based off of her actions. And so if you want to disagree with me, that's fine. Feel free to disagree with me if you want. But I think one of the greatest attributes that made Bathsheba beautiful, again, and obviously I understand that when it said that she was beautiful, it was beautiful to look upon, that when you looked at her, you looked and said, that is a beautiful woman. But we all know that there are beautiful women that have terrible personalities. There are beautiful women that have absolutely horrible personalities that once you meet them and speak to them for the first time, you're like, I don't ever want to speak to that person again. And then there are women who are not beautiful, physically attractive, but they have such a good personality that you're just drawn to them because they're so sweet. I think Bathsheba had both. I think she had both. And so what we're going to look at here, we're going to look at this, and I believe that Bathsheba's greatest attribute, was forgiveness. It was forgiveness. And so that's why I read what I read right there, and I know that I read New Testament. But you have to understand that everything that happened to Bathsheba, people say it all the time, whatever happens to you will either make you bitter or it'll make you better. It'll make you bitter or it's going to make you better. And not everything, and not everything that happens to us is good things, I think I heard someone say the other day, that they, actually, I think it was Brother Keith, whenever he was preaching, that and it's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing to grasp hold of. It's easy to say, but when it happens to you, it's even harder to deal with. But he said, he struggled with the fact that bad things happen to good people. Bad things happen to good people. And then those good people have to react to that bad thing that happened to them. And you have a choice. You have a choice. When I read right there, it says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking. Have you ever met someone that's been done wrong? Have you ever met someone that's been done wrong and they want everybody to know they've been done wrong? They want everybody to know. And you may talk to someone that you had a prior relationship with, and then something tragic, something dramatic happened in their life, and because that thing happened in their life, they chose to get bitter over it. They chose to be angry over it. They chose to not move on from it. And because of that you get around them and you're like, I don't even want to be around that person anymore. I don't even want to be around that person anymore. This is a person that I used to care for and I used to love and I used to really enjoy fellowshipping with. But now they're so bitter and they're just so angry, and you can't say anything without them snapping. You can't say anything without them bringing up what happened in the past, whether it was 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road. They're still dwelling on that thing that happened many years ago. And Bathsheba was not that person. Did she deserve to be? When I read it, I feel like it. And I know they said that Brother Sammy said many times, don't say anything bad about Bathsheba because the Bible never says anything bad about her. And so even though we know she committed adultery, she was a married woman and she committed adultery with David. The Bible at the end of chapter number 11, verse 27, it says, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. It doesn't say the thing that David and Bathsheba had done. It says the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And so what I want us to look at, and again, we're not going to get done with it today. We're gonna roll through this. But Bathsheba had to have forgiveness in her heart. She had to be a person that could forgive. And I didn't put it in here, but it's also true. Forgiveness and forgetting. Forgiveness and forgetting. I know a lot of people, and I understand. I mean, sometimes you've been done wrong. You've been done wrong, and you forgive that person, but there's a trust that's been broken. There's a trust that's been broken that I forgive that person, but it's going to be hard for me to lay my hand back up on the burner again. I understand that. I understand that, look, I've forgiven you. There's no more anger towards you. There's no more malice towards you. It's over, but it's going to be hard for me to lay my hand back up on the burner. And some people are, well, then you really didn't forgive them. That's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily true. But with Bathsheba, I believe she did. She had to forgive and she had to forget. Because a lot of times, whether you, I'm just going to say if you're married. If you're married, sometimes you're rolling along and everything's good, and you don't realize that your spouse has this laundry list that she's got in her back pocket or he's got in his back pocket that he keeps and he maintains. And anytime y'all have a little bit of friction, they bring out that laundry list and say, well, in 1997, you did this. And in 1998, you did this. It's like, hey, I thought that was gone. I thought that was over with. I thought we were done with that. No. And then in 1999, you did this, and you have to deal with this laundry list every time y'all have an issue. You can't have a good marriage if one of the two of y'all or both of y'all have a laundry list. You cannot have a good marriage if every time y'all have an issue, you go back and start rehashing issues sometime eventually you have to forgive and forget it. You have to get over it. And we're going to see that Bathsheba, and I'm basing this off of Bathsheba marrying David, and that wasn't necessarily right, but, she married him. But then after, when she had Solomon, and God looked down on Solomon and said what he thought of Solomon, and then how they raised Solomon, and things that happened in her life, you're going to see that Bathsheba did an excellent job of forgiving and forgetting. And so, but I want us to understand that it was not easy. It's not always easy, it's easy for me to stand up here and say, Paul, whoever you're mad at, you need to forgive them. It's easy for me to say that, but I haven't been done wrong. I'm not it's easy for me to say that. It's easy for me to look at Gil and say, hey, Gil, whoever you're mad at, whoever's done you wrong, you should just forgive them. That's very easy for me to say. And possibly I can say, hey, Gil, let me tell you my experience where someone did me wrong, and because they did me wrong, this is how I felt, and I just had to forgive them. And sometimes you have to forgive even though it's not asked for. If you're going to get better, you have to forgive even when it's not asked for. I could forgive that person if they would just come to me and say, look, I'm really sorry. I could forgive that person if they would just come to me and say, look, I did you wrong. What I did wasn't right, and I'm supposed to be a Christian, and I wasn't having a very Christ-like spirit, and I did this thing to you, and it was wrong, and it hurt you, and you did nothing to deserve it, and I did everything. It was completely my fault, and I'm sorry. Brother Parks, a lot of times it's easy to forgive someone if they come with that spirit. But can you forgive someone if they come to you and don't have that, or they don't come to you? I remember my father-in-law, he tried to get right with a lot of people that hurt him. He would tell them, look, whatever happened between me and you, I'll take all the blame. I'll take all the blame. Just give me all the blame. It was my fault, and I'll take all the blame. Can we just go back to being friends? And it was difficult, because some people be like, oh, Brother Wayne, that's not true. That's not right. It was me. But other people are like, okay. What does that mean? That means they still hadn't acknowledged their part in the disagreement. They still hadn't acknowledged that they did him wrong. They're like, okay, that's fine. You take all the blame. And it hurt him. It hurt him more, because he's like, can you believe that I tried to do this? And he did move on. He tried to move on. But because they're like, okay, you're right, that's fine, take all the blame, that'll be just fine. It hurt him. Can you forgive someone that doesn't ask for forgiveness? Can you forgive someone that whenever you say, hey, look, I just want it to be over with, they say, well, I don't even know what you're talking about. Even though they had the knife, they'd stick the knife in, and when they stuck the knife in, they wouldn't just pull it right back out. They'd twist the knife a few times before they pulled it out, and it was them, and they're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I didn't even realize there was a problem. Of course you knew there was a problem. You were the cause of the problem. You were the creator of the problem. Everyone around us knew there was a problem, because you couldn't keep your mouth shut and say, hey, I've got a problem, and not say I've got a problem with this person. You tried to turn my friends against me. You tried to turn the people that I had a relationship against me. That's what you were constantly doing. And they're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't even know. And I say it all the time, Miss Jimmy, and it's true. People get hurt in church. People get hurt in church, Gil, and I don't think it's always intentional, but Ben, people get hurt in church, and we all expect people to be Christians that are in church, but not everyone that goes to church is Christ-like. And we expect, well, this person's been in church, they've been in church for a long time. Guess what? I'm sorry, but there's a lot of carnal people in church. There's a lot of carnal people in church. There's a lot of people that even if you have a position, a Sunday school teacher, or a deacon, or, the song leader, or the pianist, or, whoever. They have this position, or even the pastor. We have to understand that not any of us are perfect. Not any of us are perfect. It's one of the things I try and get through to my kids, to understand that, hey, look, every person you meet's just a man. They're just a man. And they're fallible. There's a possibility they're going to do something that hurts you. There's a possibility they're going to say something that hurts you. There's a possibility that they're going to do something that David does something that they're like, I cannot believe he did that. And we're going to see, which we've talked about before, but we're going to see Ahithophel did not forgive. He never got over it. He never got over it. And he died a bitter man. He died at his own hands, a bitter man. But Bathsheba, who it was done to, did not die a bitter woman. She died a woman whose husband was the king and whose son was the king. And not only that, which she didn't know it at the time, but one of her other sons was going to be who the lineage of Christ comes through. One of her other sons. Why? Because she was able to forgive. So, in 1 Samuel chapter number 18, here is Bathsheba, and Bathsheba had to forgive. The first person she had to forgive was David. You say, well, that's a no-brainer. It is a no-brainer. But she had to forgive David. Who did Bathsheba wrong? David. Who created the problem? David. Who was the cause of all her heartache? David. All of that, and she had to forgive him. And so the first thing I thought about was that David shattered her image of David. David shattered her image of David. Now, again, like I said, all of us have people that I say all of us, but we all have people that we look up to or have looked up to. If you like sports, they call them heroes. I don't want to call anybody that kicks a ball or throws a ball or swings a bat a hero. I think heroes should be reserved for like people that fight in a war, not someone that kicks a ball. And I'm a guy that likes sports, but I'm not calling some guy that can throw a ball 65 yards downfield a hero. He's just a guy that can throw a ball 65 yards down the field. But, you got to think, there was nobody in Israel bigger than David. There was nobody bigger than David. You think about the image of David in 1 Samuel chapter number 18, verse number 6. It says, "And it came to pass as they came, and when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And so, again, you got to think, here's Bathsheba, and Bathsheba is growing up. She's growing up at this time. And maybe the Bible doesn't say she was one of those, but there is a possibility that she could have been one of these women, or even a young girl that came out and was dancing and was saying that Saul had slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And what God had begun to promote even before David was ever anointed to be king. Here is a young man that stood up one day when all of the army of Israel was scared to face the giant. And here comes this young man that says, hey, is there not a cause? Is there not a cause? And he goes out and faces that giant, and God allows him to kill Goliath. And because of that, David's name, he's instantly he's instantly a national hero. He instantly becomes a national hero. We think about people that, you think about George Washington and everything that George Washington did at the founding of this country. What was he? He was a national hero. And that's why they really wanted him to just keep being president. And he's like, no, this has got to stop. I'm not going to be a king. We don't need a king. That's not what we need. I'm not going to continue to be the president. Y'all need to vote someone else in. And so, but again, you think about these people that, a lot of times, again, they are war heroes. They're war heroes that they go out and they do great deeds in war, and because of that, they get, when they come back, they get promoted. And I know that the world flipped upside down during Vietnam, and how that the people who went out and laid their life on the line for the country were treated miserably whenever they come home. I understand that, but it wasn't always that way. And war heroes, a lot of times, you think, whatever you think of the Civil War, but Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, and then you have Eisenhower who becomes president. It's these people who were war heroes that become president. And so here, David instantaneously at the killing of the Philistine, becomes a favorite of all the women in Israel. And no doubt, as a young man, before David ever got married, I'm sure that every mother in Israel said, hey, I've got a daughter. I sure would love for my daughter to one day be married to David. Think about that right there. And so in 2 Samuel chapter number 6, David was not only a war hero, but David was also, again, the Bible says that he was a man after God's own heart. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse number 13, it says, and it was so that when they that bare the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with a linen ephod, and so David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. I'm going to stop reading right here. David was not only a war hero, he was a man that it says loved God with all his heart, and he is a man that brought the ark, so he was a religious hero as well. He was very devout. Obviously, we understand until this thing that happened in his life with Bathsheba. There was, very rarely could you even look and say, maybe David shouldn't have done that. But that's in our eyes. But God said, except for the matter of Uriah the Hittite, basically he's like, hey, everything else David did, I'm good with. Again, we can look at some of the things that he did when he was hiding from Saul and say, well, maybe he shouldn't have been down there with the Philistines to begin with. But God doesn't say that about him. God doesn't say that about him. But so here you have David, and David is bringing up the ark, and David is out there, and he's worshiping God with his whole heart. And so, Brother Croft, it's very difficult when you see someone. I'm sure if I ask y'all to say, hey, tell me a preacher that's let you down. Tell me a preacher, tell me a man of God that you had ultimate respect for and looked up to him as a man of God and said, that man right there, I want to emulate him. I want to be like him. I want my wife to act like his wife. I want my kids to be as good a kids as his. And then something happens, whether he commits a sin or something like that, and then or he just goes liberal and just starts doing things that he preached against for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden he's not preaching against them anymore, and the next thing you know, you find out he's not preaching against them because he's doing them. Just go to Dollywood sometime. If you ever want to be disappointed, just go to Dollywood. People kind of let their hair down, Miss Jimmy, a little bit when they go to Dollywood, and you come walking around and you see somebody, and you're like, hey, that's not how you dress when you're at the camp meeting, and I don't think you have to have a suit and tie on when you're at the Dollywood. But whenever you preach against wearing shorts and then you're walking around Dollywood with shorts on, I don't know about all that. Whenever you're in with a conservative crowd and your wife's wearing a dress all the way to her ankles, but then whenever she's out on her own, she's got a mini skirt on and it's way up above her knee, you're like, what in the world? And you just get disappointed. It happens. It happens. And again, I'm just going to tell you that men are men and they're fallible. They're not perfect. And it's disappointing when someone's a hypocrite. It is. It's terribly disappointing. And depending on who it is in your life, it's hard to get over. Depending on who it is and how close you are to that person, sometimes it's really hard to get over. But and that's why I want my kids, to have a relationship with Christ, because he's not ever going to disappoint you. Have your relationship with God, he's not going to disappoint you. But you have your relationship with man, it's going to happen. Even if they never commit a sin, they're just going to have a bad day one day, Brother Parks. And we get them so exalted in our mind that we feel like they're never going to have a bad day. And then one day they're having a bad day and they had a fight at the house and they say something and they're real sharp-tongued to their wife. And you're like, what? He just told me that I ought to love my wife. As Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And look at how he just treated her. And the devil uses he'll just plant just a little seed, just a little leaven up the whole lump. He'll just plant a little seed right there, and then you'll be watching. And then every time he says something, a little cutting to his wife, you'll be like, hypocrite, hypocrite. And there are people that are not in church today because they saw a man of God do something that at one point in time he preached against. And they're like, can't do it, can't deal with it. All church is just a bunch of hypocrites. It's just a house of hypocrites. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's true. But I don't think all church is a bunch of hypocrites. But I think if you look around long enough and you look around hard enough and get your magnifying glass out on every person's life in here, you'll find a spot where you're like, he says one thing, but it's not quite as tight as he says it is. He says it this way, but it's not quite as tight. He expects us to live tight, but then in his own life, he doesn't live quite that tight. And again, your focus is on the wrong person. Your focus is on the wrong person. Get your magnifying glass out and start magnifying Jesus, and you'll find out how good he is. You won't find any bad in him. Get your magnifying glass out and find out how good God is, and you're not going to find any bad in him. But when you start magnifying man and get them exalted too much, when they disappoint you, it's going to be a great disappointment. And so here is David, and they watched him, and they knew that Samuel had anointed him to be king, and they watched how he dealt with Saul and Jonathan, even though he had been anointed king, and how that he waited until God brought him up to be king. And now here it is that David is wanting that ark where it should be in Jerusalem. It should be with the people, not hid out in the countryside somewhere. But so David shattered her image of David, first of all, as a national hero, then as a man after God's own heart. Again, like I said, and I put this down somewhere, but Bathsheba saw David at his worst. Do you know anybody that saw David any worse than Bathsheba did? She saw him at his worst. She saw him where the other women looked and just said, "Oh, look how wonderful he is." She looked and said, "I'm afraid of the way he's looking at me right now. He's scaring me." Well, again, think about it. Think about it. Whenever whenever he called for Bathsheba, she is a military wife. She is a military wife whose husband is out on the battlefield. Any person in here who was in the military knows someone that's in the military and their wife's at home. Their wife does not want to see a U.S. government car pull up to their house and a couple men walk up and knock on their door. That they know what that means. They've either been seriously injured or they're dead. They know what that means. And so here she gets that knock on her door that night, and they're like, hey, the king wants to see you. Well, I'm not, and it says they took her. I'm not dressed, I'm not this, I'm not that. They took her. You got to go see the king. She has no idea, Brother Parks, when she goes up there. She doesn't know something happened to Uriah. She has no idea why the king wants to see her. But again, and there's not many women in here, but I imagine every woman in here could say that they know the look when a man is looking at her and they're not thinking about anything but one thing. And I think when she got put in that room, Brother Croft, and that door got closed behind her, she knew she was in trouble. And she saw David at his worst. She saw a man that was a man after God's own heart that for a little while was not thinking about God, was not thinking about his reputation, was not thinking about his position in life, was not thinking about anything but one thing. And she saw that in him. Not only did she have to deal with that, she also, you think about it in 2 Samuel 15, you think about, here is David in 2 Samuel 15, verse number 12. It says, and Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor. And then in chapter number 16, verse number 23, and the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and Absalom. And so Ahithophel was David's counselor. Ahithophel was David's friend. But Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. And so every family dinner, you know how it is when you respect someone and you love someone, that's who you talk about. That's who you talk about. And you talk about how good David is and how great David is, how wonderful a man David is, and how God is using David, how God is using David, and how God is, just establishing David. Every move he makes, God is just more and more establishing David as the king of Israel, and how that David is a man after God's own heart. And that got shattered in a moment. That got shattered. Not only that, but in 2 Samuel chapter number 23, verse number 34, we also know that one of David's mighty men, in verse number 34, says, Eliphaz, the son of Ahishbai, the son of Mechathite, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gileonite. So here, her father was one of David's mighty men. So again, like I said, if you're a soldier, and I understand that there are bad leaders. I understand there are bad leaders. But I also understand that there are some leaders that as a soldier, that if they told you that, there's 50 enemy out there on the hill and you're charging them with a pistol, you're going to go charge them with a pistol, even though it's a very good possibility you're going to die because your leader said, hey, we're going to go charge them with this pistol. And so here is Bathsheba, and all she's heard from Ahithophel is how wonderful David is. All she's heard from Eliam is how wonderful David is. And the last person we know in verse number 29 of the same chapter is that Uriah, and I'm not going to read it because we know who he is. We also know that Uriah. So all she's ever heard about David was how wonderful he was. All she'd ever heard was David, 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 David this, David that, David such a good guy, David such a good leader. I would die for David. If David told me to do this, if I had to charge the whole army of the Philistines by myself with a sling and 5 stones, as long as David told me to go, then that's what I'd go do, because he killed the giant. And David, 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 that's all she ever heard. But guess what? When she saw him, that's not what she saw. When she thought about him, everyone else in the country still thought of him that way, but that's not how she thought of him. And so again, I said it earlier, she saw him at his worst. She saw him at his worst. She saw him with lust in his eyes and his heart. She saw the callous way he dealt with her after committing adultery with her. Again, from what we understand from the passage, when he was done, he just sent her back home. He just sent her back home. And the next conversation that we know of that they had, she told him, hey, I'm pregnant. He didn't send flowers. He didn't send chocolates. He didn't send it, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have done it. Again, we know that he goes 9 months. He goes 9 solid months of not being right with God, and at least outwardly, at least not to the satisfaction of God, dealing with it in a way that it needed to be dealt with. And so she's just sent home. And imagine her again. I mean, she's sent home, and she understands, she understands that there's a possibility that she's pregnant. And so she's got her little calendar out, and she's like, let me go back to the last time, and then let me count until the next time. And so, Brother Croft, she had to live in fear. She had to live in fear, because it wasn't like she could go to the dollar store and buy a $3 test and look and see whether it had a plus sign or a negative sign in it. She couldn't do that. So she had to live in fear while David's up there living in the palace, while David's living with his 5 other wives or 6 other wives and his concubines. She's living in fear every single day. Day 15, fear. 16, 17, 18. And I don't remember what day it's supposed to happen, but she's late. And then she's late another day and another day. Maybe I'll wait a week. I don't know how long she had to wait before she finally said, look, it's been 2 months. Doesn't tell us. It's been 2 months. Yeah, I'm pregnant. But she had to sit there and live in fear while he lived in the palace. She lived in her house in fear. And again, I mean, he's David. He's the king. He can get out of this. But I mean, what's going to happen whenever my husband finds out that I've been unfaithful? What's going to happen to me when my husband finds out that I've been unfaithful? And so she sends the message up to David. And as far as we know, David never sends a response to her. He never says, hey, I've concocted a plan, and here's my plan. I'm going to bring your husband back, and I want you to sleep with your husband, and then I'm going to send him off for a while, and when he comes back, you're going to have a baby. Again, I don't think she was down. Brother Tyrone said it. I don't think she would have been down with the plan. I don't think she necessarily would have been down with the plan. It was David's plan. He thought it was a good plan. I mean, in my mind, I'm like, well, I mean, for that matter, you didn't even need to go ask for Uriah. You could have just had him stay out long enough until he comes back and she's holding a baby and she says it's his. You didn't have to bring him in because, I mean, she's already she's already at least a month or more along. And then you're going to have to, then they're going to have to do what he wanted done and then send him off again. And when he comes back, here's this baby. Again, none of that ever really needed to happen. But David just expected her. He just expected her that when Uriah showed up and he sent Uriah down to the house, that she was going to do what husband and wives do, and everything was going to be fine. And maybe the first time she figured it out was when that mess of meat came after Uriah was brought back. Maybe the first time there was a knock on the door, and she opens the door, and here's this big mess of meat. What is this? Oh, yeah, David brought Uriah back, and he's supposed to come down to the house. Again, Brother Tyrone said it. I don't know that she'd have been good with that. Again, we're adults in here. We understand what he was asking her to do. That's pretty difficult. It's pretty callous. It's pretty callous to think about, like, look, I don't need you anymore, and I really just want everything to be smoothed over so no one knows that I did anything. And so I really just want your husband to come down here, and then we can pretend like the child is your husband's. That's what David asked Bathsheba to do. That is what David asked Bathsheba to do. And then Uriah never comes home. And no doubt, again, God tells him whenever Nathan's dealing with him that the enemies of God are blaspheming because they know what happened. No doubt eventually it got to Bathsheba that this is all the things that David did to try to get Uriah to come down to the house. And he never came down to the house. And eventually it must get to Bathsheba that David sent a letter by her husband's hand and said, hey, take this to Joab. And when Joab read the letter, he said, okay, and had her husband killed. This is the person that she's going to end up married to. She's going to end up married to this man. And so he kills Uriah. And then he takes her. It says he takes her. At the end of the passage right there, it says verse 27 says he fetched her. And when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife. It was almost like she didn't have a choice in the matter. It was like, hey, your husband's dead. No one's going to have you now. And so I've already been with you. The child is mine. So guess what? Just come on up here and we'll be married. It'll be great. It'll be wonderful. Again, like I said, for most people that have been married, you have your story. Like your story. Miss Jimmy, tell me about when you and Brother Sammy met. Or not necessarily even when you met, but tell me about when you and Brother Sammy fell in love. Or Brother Parks, tell me about when you and Miss Parks fell in love. For me and my wife, we can tell you a story. Can you imagine Bathsheba telling the story? Well, tell me about when you and David fell in love. Was it this time? No, it didn't happen till later. I don't want to talk about when we first met. I don't want to talk about when we first met. I can't talk about when we first met. And so he just took her and said, hey, you're now my wife. We're married. And so, and I'm going to stop right here. But for all those months until Nathan comes, when she saw David, she saw a man that was not right with God. When she saw David, David had not got right with God. And you know how it is. If you know someone that you love and you respect and you've been close to, and you know how they were when they were right with God, and you know how they are when we call it when they're not right with God, when they're backslidden, when they're cold in their heart, they're just different. They're just different. It's just a different person. It's just a different person. And sometimes if you're very perceptive, you might sense a little bit of it. You might, something's just not quite right. I'll never forget whenever me and my wife stopped on our way. I was in Maryland, and my buddy that was from Maryland had been at Brother Norris's camp meeting when Brother Norris was in South Carolina, and we met them in Virginia. And when we got in the car, we said, something is not right about them two. And Brother Parks, right after that, he ended up going into the military, and then not long after that, she filed for divorce because she said he abandoned them, and both of their lives went just right down the dumpster. And anytime you have someone that you've known when they were close to God or trying to be close to God and right with God, and then you're around them when they're cold, everything about them's wrong. Think about someone that you knew of when they were close to God, and then they got away from God, and how they acted. And sometimes they even act like Peter. Whenever Peter was denying the Lord, what was he doing? He even cursed just to say, look, I want you to understand that's not who I am. And they just get angry and bitter and just mean. And you're like, why? Why are you acting this way? That, for 9 months, that's who she saw. She didn't see Mr. Wonderful. She didn't see Mr. Perfect in God's eyes. She didn't see Mr. Love God with all his heart. She saw that guy. Thank you. We'll go on next week.